Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. For almost a decade, they groomed young girls in Oxford, then abused them and sold them for sex around the country. Today, 7 men were found guilty of offences including the rape and exploitation of children as young as 11. The court heard how the girls were plied with alcohol and drugs before being abused. The men will be sentenced next month. And just to warn you, Tom Simon's report contains disturbing details of the gang's activities.
The men behind one of the most serious cases in recent years of what's become known as street grooming. Their victims, vulnerable young teenage girls in Oxford. It took 7 years for police and social workers to work out what was happening.
But specifically to the incident that we discussed.
But when they made arrests, the gang simply denied it.
She said that that's you. Why would she say that? That wasn't me.
Or refused to say anything at all.
How do you get around?
No comment.
Today's convictions brought this reaction from the police.
These vile predators in the dock today, those that have been found guilty, groom, corrupt, isolate and sexually abuse their victims to the point of torture in some cases. You know, it is really important that we stamp this horrific crime out now.
It began on Oxford streets when the girls were between 11 and 15. They were abused in hotels like this, private flats. One victim was raped by a group in these woods. By the end, the girls were describing the gang as sick sex monsters, driven by a pack mentality. The 7 defendants were found guilty of 59 charges, including 38 of rape, sometimes several men abusing one victim, 9 of arranging prostitution, and 5 counts of trafficking for sexual exploitation. It's hard to convey the violence this gang inflicted on its victims. Scratching, choking, biting, beating, branding with a hot wire, threatening to kill by beheading. All for the pleasure of the gang and their friends who paid to take part.
You have enabled your abusers to face trial.
The message from prosecutors to the children who gave evidence. They're considering new ways to deal with these cases.
We have to recognise that it's highly unlikely that vulnerable victims such as these will walk into a police station and give a coherent and full account first time. So we have to work with them to enable them to give a full account. But we equally have to focus as intently on the suspect as we do on the victim.
The gang has been told long sentences are inevitable. Tom Simons, BBC News at the Old Bailey.
The gang preyed on girls who came from troubled backgrounds, grooming them until they were under their control. Alison Holt has been speaking to some of the young victims.
This was a lonely, brutal world for the already troubled girls who were exploited. The court heard how they were effectively brainwashed into viewing their abusers as friends, how those men fed them with drink and drugs, getting them addicted to crack and heroin, raping them and selling them. This young woman was one of the victims. She was just 12 when the men first approached her.
I think to myself, why didn't I run away, or why didn't I, try and get away? I was scared to say no because they wouldn't accept no as an answer for anything.
Known in court as Girl 3, she told how she was taken to this hotel and other places in Oxford to be abused by appointment. The men had travelled for miles.
It's emergency.
I could hear a woman getting slapped about next door to my room.
This was 2006 when a guest in another room became so worried by what was happening next door, he called the police.
It sounded like the guy had a prostitute in his room and started turning a bit sour on her.
It wasn't a prostitute, it was Girl 3. She was 14 and was being raped and beaten in this room by Bassam Karar. There was a police investigation, but she was persuaded by another girl to drop the complaint.
I was out almost every day away from home, sometimes more than one day at a time. Sometimes I'd have breaks where I went home to my mum and I just ended up in hospital because I'd had so many drugs. So a majority of the time I was away having sex with different men.
The gang would also traffic her to places like Coventry, Manchester and London. Still just 13, no longer going to school, she had disappeared off the radar of normal teenage life. Her mum, who tried to keep her home, had to pick up the pieces.
She couldn't remember where she had been. She was incredibly distressed, sometimes still quite angry, but usually very distressed. And we would go home, and usually the first thing she wanted to do was sit on my knee, suck her thumb and pretend to be a baby.
Sometimes within hours, a text or phone call would come, her daughter would go into automatic mode, get into a waiting car and be driven off.
I went round ringing, writing, speaking to every conceivable service I could think of in Oxfordshire, begging for help, and they almost all sort of closed the door in my face.
The at times sadistic abuse of these girls went on for years. Most of the victims spent time in local authority care, and Oxfordshire County Council accepts it failed to protect them.
This is a horrendous thing that's happened. We're really sorry that it took so long. We have learnt a huge amount over this period of years in terms of how to deal with things. Going back, social workers were doing their utmost to try and protect children. I don't think we realised quite what we're up against then. We've learnt a lot with the police subsequently.
The case has also raised questions for the local community. Most of the men were of Pakistani origin, 2 of North African heritage. The court was told most customers were Asian and the victims were white. Tonight, faith leaders in Oxford have condemned what happened as a wicked crime, but say those who exploit children come from all communities. Alison Holt, BBC News.